Following that, we'll ask them to break character, and they'll tell us about their life as whomever they've been. So we'll begin then with our only woman presenter, the famous American artist, Georgia O'Keeffe.
I've been dead for 14 years. The last time I felt these rocks, I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I picked up rocks and wood and bones on the desert floor. I brought them into my home and placed them on my ledges and my tables. I lived with these things and I painted them. I've been asked to talk with you today about my contributions to the millennium, about myself, and my art. I don't have a lot of time to talk, and that's good, because you see, I'm a person that didn't like words very much. I spoke a language of lines and shapes and colors, which for me was far more accurate than a language of words. So this millennium idea, well, Jack Coward states that she continued to look at things from a different point of view and to challenge our own kind of vision. I suppose a response in the year 2000 might read that I altered perceptions perceptibly. Well, I would say that if I made the flower the size it was, you wouldn't look at it. So I decided to make it large, so that you'd have to look at it, so that you might see what I saw or feel what I felt when I painted the flower. Now, when I was born, and where and how I have lived is unimportant. It is what I have done with where I have lived that should be of interest. So, I'd like to begin my conversation in the year 1915. And this is when my work became of interest to others. I set aside my formal education, abandoned the practices that went along with that, and I started making shapes. Shapes that my mind seemed to know nothing about sometimes. Well, I decided to bundle up these drawings and send them to my friend Anita Politzer in New York. Now, Anita was my very good friend, and I trusted her. And I said, please don't show anyone. Well, she took the liberty of breaking that promise. And she took these drawings to Alfred Stieglitz. This is a portrait of Stieglitz in 1909. 17 years later, I would marry him. People wondered, how'd you get along with him? And I said, well, I was interested in what he did, and he was interested in what I did. You see, he was a leading photographer of the century, a major art impresario. And if you wanted to get anything accomplished, you had your work in his gallery, 291, where the work of many artists who came showed their work, debuted for the first time. This is the Picasso-Braque exhibit. First place where Picasso and Braque showed their work in the United States, along with Paul Cézanne and Henri Matisse. Stieglitz felt my work was more truly inspired than any work he had ever seen. This is when I was at Texas State Normal College, about 1916, and I was head of the art department there until 1918. Well, I started communicating with Stieglitz. This is my classroom, and this is a photograph of myself. And he convinced me to move back to New York. He said that he would support me so that I could focus on my work, so that I could paint. Well, you didn't argue with Stieglitz much, and I liked him. I'd been communicating with him. I liked his letters. Well, I moved back, and he started photographing me again and again. And again, and I'd sit there for 3 and 4 minutes sometimes without moving. Couldn't even touch anything. The itchiness drove me crazy. Well, he also loved to photograph my hands. And he made many nude photographs of me, but that's for another conversation. After I married Stieglitz, and this is in the year 1925, I started the flower series. And this painting is entitled Red and Green on a White Background. Of course, all the male artists love to look at this painting and talk about the feminine qualities of the color in my work. I guess what I would say about this is that I cropped the image so that you could see what I was looking at. And I'm indebted to Stieglitz for this. As you can see in his equivalent photograph, there's similarity in the way we looked at our composition. And I made paintings of clamshells, closed clamshells, and open clamshells. No, I know. Female genitalia. Well, until the day I died, I said I never meant to paint that. Why, if you saw sexual symbols in my painting, you were talking about yourself, not about me. Oriental poppies always amused me why people looked at my flower paintings and wondered why I made the flowers so large. I always wondered why they didn't ask me why I made the river so small. New York City at night. Stieglitz wondered why I was interested in making this painting when the men didn't even paint it very well. I said, well, I was interested in the streets, the way they look like long, thin bottles with things floating in them up and down. You see? I went to New Mexico in 1929. When I got there, I felt like it was mine. The air, the wind, and the sky was different. Didn't need people in the paintings, they cluttered it. But I didn't want to say that too loud about how much I liked New Mexico, because I didn't want people moving there. Ranchos Church, every artist painted this church. And I thought the whole church was just too much. A little was enough, so I selected this portion. Jack in the Pulpit made many paintings of these. Finally, I ended up just painting the Jack. 1931, everyone was talking about the great American novel. All the men were talking about that. Well, I thought that was really interesting, since most of the men that I knew never had even crossed the Hudson River. But when I was making this painting, I decided that it needed something else. So I put a red stripe on each side, and I called it my Great American Painting. This was the cornerstone painting for the Whitney exhibit, Summer Days. Well, they liked this painting a lot, and it ended up to be the cover of my autobiography. Actually, they call it my autobiography, but I would say it's a book about my work, a book about my paintings. Everyone wondered why I made paintings of bones, because they thought they were so morbid. Well, I always thought bones were rather lively. And besides, I was interested in the holes in the bones, the way the sky moved through them. Blackbird being held up by the snow made a lot of these paintings. I thought it was really curious the way the snow seemed to hold up the sky, and the blackbird seemed to move in and out of his face. When I moved to Abiquiu, I moved to this home because I had to have this black door. Patio with a Black Door is the title of this painting. Ladder to the Moon, the ladder leading from Medernal Mountain up to the moon. I made a bet with God. I said, if I make this painting enough, it'll be mine. That mountain will belong to me. My friends thought it was curious that I would make a pact with God. This was one of the last paintings that I made, Sky Above Clouds. I'd hoped that it would be the finale of my paintings. I don't really think it was. It's a very large painting. My eyesight was going at the time. It is at the Chicago Art Museum. If you mount the steps towards the collection of modern art, you'll see it there. Black rock against the blue sky. This was really one of my last paintings. And my friend and analyst, Virginia Christensen, looked at this painting, and then she left a note next to it. And the note said, "This is like a blackbird without wings." I had to go to my room and compose myself. Perhaps it was like me losing my eyesight, me losing my wings. Towards the end of my life, I was connected with images in this clay studio. Juan Hamilton, who was my companion, caretaker, and a ceramic artist, many years my junior, brought me into the studio and connected me with shapes that still put me in touch with images that I liked. I I died on March 6th, 1986. There was no fanfare and no inspirational messages. I was on the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times. Juan Hamilton took my ashes to the top of Padernal Mountain and cast them to a brisk wind. I said to Sherwin Anderson in 1926, "The thing is to make your unknown known." I'm not sure I accomplished that. That's quite a challenge. But I will say that I was an artist, kept pace with my time, lived in my time, and I made paintings so that you could see what I saw.
Thank you, Ms. O'Keefe. Our next presenter is going to be from the world of literature. I'd like you to please welcome F. Scott Fitzgerald, famous American writer.
Suppose you're in your office. You've been fighting duels all day. You're tired. This is you. A woman enters the room. You've seen her before, but she doesn't see you this time. She crosses to a desk, takes off her gloves, empties out her purse. She has 1 nickel, 2 dimes, and a cardboard matchbox. She crosses to a wood-burning stove you happen to have in your office. Takes the gloves, they're black, puts them in the grate, closes it, and discovers that she has only 1 match left. Just then the phone rings. She picks it up, says hello, and very deliberately says, "I have never owned a pair of black gloves in my life." Hangs up. Kneels before the stove and is just about to strike the match. When suddenly, a man enters from the shadows, watching her every move. Now, what does all that mean? I don't know. I was just making pictures. By the way, Ernest, what was the nickel for?
It's for the movies.
The nickel is for the movies. I understand that you folks come from a world in which if someone wants to go to the movies, it costs a little more than a nickel. Most of you know me as the author of The Great Gatsby, most of which I wrote when I was 28 years old, living in a villa overlooking a beach in the south of France with my daughter Scotty and with my wife, Zelda, my poor, lost Zelda. But the scene I just presented to you is from my final novel, The Last Tycoon, a novel of Hollywood, in which the main character, Monroe Starr, the head of a major Hollywood studio, is explaining to a screenwriter that in the movies, the visual is more important than the verbal, that the image matters more than the word. It was a lesson I needed to learn myself because I went out to Hollywood 3 different times in my life, including the last 3.5 years, working as a screenwriter for all the major studios. It was a necessity. I had to. I was supporting 3 different households. Myself out in LA, Scotty by that time, back east at Vassar, and Zelda, who was in an institution in North Carolina. Funny thing, I worked on him for, I think, a grand total of 2 weeks on a movie that I think you've probably heard of, Gone with the Wind. And I got my only screenwriting credit for a movie you haven't heard of, Three Comrades, 1938. It was about that time that Ernest came out to LA, full of prestige, doing fundraising for the forces fighting Franco in the Spanish-American War. He showed an anti-fascist film caused quite a sensation in LA. Everyone wanted to meet him. My situation was somewhat different in 1937. I was washed up, has been, forgotten as a writer. Very different than our situations in 1925. Do you remember when we first met at the Dingo Bar, an American hangout in Paris? I had just published my 3rd novel, Gatsby. I published 2 collections of short stories. I was internationally known. And Ernest, at that point, had published exactly 2 short essays. But I'd read his work. I'd written Max Perkins, our editor, back at Scribner's. I told him this man was the real thing. We exchanged letters, took each other's edits. I remember he took a lot of my suggestions on The Sun Also Rises. We had a lot of respect for one another. And then, in 1931, in your short story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, you took your potshots at me. Said that I was a rummy, that I would never amount to anything as a writer, that I was washed up unless I left Zelda. Well, you don't know what it was like to be married to a woman who was insane.
What a gun.
I didn't just discard my wives one after another as you did. From the spring of 1930, the time of Zelda's first major breakdown, nearly every week for 10 years until my own death, I wrote her a letter expressing my love and my support. Well, by the middle 30s, I had published in Esquire magazine a series of essays, later to be known as the Crack-Up essays, in which there's a particular line. They were confessional pieces that talked about the effect of drink on my work, what it was like to be a has-been as a writer. But there's one line that the writers, I think, misinterpreted. I had said that the test of a truly first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in the mind at the same time. Now, the critics thought this was very original, but in fact, I simply borrowed it from my favorite of all the English poets, John Keats, who had said the same thing back in 1817. Now, the reason that line was important is that I lived that contradiction and that mystery in 2 ways. Zelda was permanently insane. Zelda would one day be cured. I had to believe desperately in the truth of both those propositions. And secondly, I was a failure as a writer. One day, somehow, I would be a success as a writer. All I wanted to do was get back to the past. I wanted to get back, as in the final pages of Gatsby, to the past, to the day in 1919 when I stood on the front lawn of a mansion in Montgomery, Alabama, dressed as a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army, and for the first time, set eyes on Zelda Sarah. We were happy for a time, but those times are gone. Well, as I wrote my daughter Scotty once, when Papa thinks thoughts like that, Papa gets very depressed. And when Papa gets depressed, Papa likes to take a little drink. Sometimes several drinks. Preferably gin. Do you folks even have a decent bar in this town? No. At any rate, Ernest, would you care to join me for a drink after? Cheers.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzgerald. We're going to turn now to the world of music, and I would like you to welcome with me Mr. George Gershwin, famous American composer.
A composer who would rather be playing. How about it's wonderful.
So anyway, my brother Ira was supposed to play the piano, so my mother and dad in Lower East Side, New York, brought a piano in through the second floor window, and Ira was supposed to play it, but Ira was a reader, so he was reading, and I just sat down, and until the summer of 1937, when I became ill with a brain tumor and passed away, I was at the piano. In fact, I did most of my composition at the piano and tried out all of my new things, whether it was Rhapsody in Blue or Concerto in F or some new show tunes, at parties all over New York City in the 20s and the 30s. And it was fun. And the number I just played, It's Wonderful, is in effect how I feel about music. And music to me is different. A lot of folks say, well, how could you live in New York with all the noise and the bustle and the chaos and the tragedy and the romance? And to me, all of that, what some people found was noise, was music. And I studied music a little bit when I was in the teenage years. And as I got more famous and became very wealthy, I was probably what today would be a millionaire in the 20s, in my early 20s. I started to do some studying because I wanted to get into more serious music. The critics were always finding me a little bit too lighthearted and probably envious that I was making so much money. So around the late 20s, I read a book called Porgy by DeBulce Haywood. And he was a fellow who wrote about the black people and the Negro people in Charleston, South Carolina, and how they lived, and the tragedies, the romance, but particularly the music and the rhythm of their lives. And I said, here is the great American opera. And so I went to work on that over a period of time in the middle 30s, 1934, 1935. And it wasn't a great success, but I knew it was what I needed to do. And I'm interested to know in my visit back here this week that the New York Opera Society is putting a full production on during this month. And so they're still playing Porgy and Bess. And earlier I played some numbers for you. It would be hard to claim that I am totally responsible for my music. My brother Ira, who was the exact opposite of me, who went to bed by 10 o'clock every night, was responsible for the incredible lyrics of my songs. And we would fight and pull hair and spend afternoons working these songs out. And somehow we just clicked, and we clicked very often. My typical day was to wake up at noon, to work on all the music that I'd invented at the parties that I'd stayed till 3 or 4 in the morning to entertain and enjoy the night before. And then I would go out to more parties. And I did this in New York, London, and Paris, where I picked up a wonderful horn that became part of the taxi horn that I use in America and Paris. And towards the end of my life, I decided that it would be fun to try my hand at film instead of the Broadway musical, and went out to Hollywood, where I ended my days. And I wasn't particularly enchanted with Hollywood. I found, as Gertrude Stein said, that when I got there, there was no there. But New York was my home. New York is where I work. New York is the music that I play and sing. And I'd like to, before I conclude this afternoon, play one song from Porgy and Bess that is really important to me and one of my favorite songs.
Hemingway's thoughts have finally cleared from the thinking of drinking, we'll be hearing from another famous American writer, Ernest Hemingway.
You all know me anyway. You know my work, I suspect. You know my life to a certain extent. You certainly know the myth. The myth is largely that. It's largely a myth. Truly, I'm a writer, not a talker. So since you're sitting comfortably, I think I'll do the same thing. I'd be much more comfortable in front of my 12 newly sharpened number 2 pencils to start the day. Ending with Fitz and Jim. The dingo. I was fairly sure it was the Ritz, but could have been a bit impaired that moment. We were both drunk. I've always wanted to be where the action was. When I was just literally out of high school, after I finished early, I went to Kansas City, light about my age, got a job as a reporter for the Kansas City Star. And I was called out to a crowd scene from the desk one day and went to the railroad station there in downtown area. There was a crowd around a gentleman who was prostrate on the floor and covered with a blanket. I came up and, what's the matter? And people said, well, he's sick. He's got a contagious disease. We won't touch him. I said, well, what have you done? And they said that, well, we called an ambulance. When? Well, about a half an hour ago. For God's sakes, he's been sitting there on the floor, unattended for half an hour. My father was a doctor. I could see he had yellow fever. And if he's not attended soon, he was going to die. Not a question in my mind about that. While these other little livers sat around waiting for something to happen, I went out, hailed a taxi cab, picked up the man, blanket and all, put him in the backseat of the taxi cab, took him to the hospital. And I charged the taxi to the Star. They paid, of course. I like to be in the thick of it, where the action was. My books are that way. I try to have that in my books at least. I always felt that each day a writer should start something new, something that hadn't been done before. And if you weren't going to do that, then you really weren't a writer. Writing, at its best, is a lonely profession. A writer must get up each day and face eternity, or the lack of it, which is an equally terrifying thought for, I think, most of us. It's a task that never is truly done, no matter how well you've done on one day, the next day, and the blank page yet awaits you. My early work was met with some success. Fitz mentioned that he had published 3 novels by the time I got 2 stories out. I might have had a better early start if my first wife, Hadley, hadn't lost a suitcase full of my work coming to visit me in Italy, where I'd gone to get away from her. Never got that checked luggage either. Damnable thing. The world is full of bad breaks. Before I came in this afternoon, I was visiting your lovely shores. Ketchum doesn't have a lake. I like Ketchum a lot, but it doesn't have a lake like you have here. It's real beautiful. I was fishing for kokanee, and so I was only using 2-ounce leader steak. Caught a Kamloops, must have been. So someone can tell me how to get some rod repair after the presentation. I'd appreciate that. But I was a writer. I always took my writing seriously. I wrote the last page of A Farewell to Arms 39 times. Critics didn't always appreciate my writing. And it's the same way that my colleague has mentioned that he was sometimes downgraded by the critics who thought his best work was past him. He had nothing left to offer. I wrote a book about a middle-aged man with a young woman across the river and into the trees, returning to a scene where he had had tremendous impact placed on his life. He was injured, as was I, during the war in 1918. I had 237 steel fragments embedded in my body. My doctor dad wasn't there to help me. It would have been nice perhaps if he had. I was shot at 6 body parts. I survived 2 plane crashes in 2 days in Africa. It was always fun. Always being where the action was. That's what takes you to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. When the critics didn't like my books, I kept working. That's what an artist does. After the critical debacle that met across the river and into the trees, I went back, spent some time in Cuba writing, and after 200 rewrites, I finally released through my publisher, The Old Man of the Sea, and that showed me like writing like it should be. I've been working for that novel really all my life, trying to capture that sense of courage, confidence, and endurance that really typifies what a man has to do in the face of overwhelming odds. See, life is not something that we simply live successfully. Ultimately, the truth is that in life you lose, of course. The important thing, what really counts, is how you conduct yourself while you're being destroyed. And that's the truth behind virtually all of my stories. So I hope that you've enjoyed some of them at least. I hope that as you see the stories, you'll come to know the word, because the man is not important, and the myth certainly is not. But I've spoken too long for a writer, so I'll invite you to buy a work at the local bookstore and continue to enjoy what I had to offer for all of us.
Thank you, Mr. Hemingway. We've had to have a change in the program this afternoon, and our friend George Orwell wasn't able to join us. But some of the younger crowd might be interested in meeting our last person here today. This is Jim Morrison, American songwriter and member of the Doors.
You dig it? My meat is real. My hands, how they move, balance like little demons. My hair, so twisted and weathered. The skin on my face, pinch the cheeks. My flaming sword tongue, spraying verbal fireflies. I'm real. I'm human. But I'm not an ordinary man. No, no, no. My name's Jim Morrison, and as you just heard, I'm a poet. Well, I'm also a songwriter, a rebel, and a leader. But most of you probably know me as a lead singer of the band The Doors. For those of you who don't know me, I'd like to give you a little background. I was born December 8th, 1943, in Melbourne, Florida. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad was a naval officer. I hated them both, so I always say they're dead. So as far as all of you know, they're dead. First memory I have was when I was 4 years old. My family was on a vacation in New Mexico. We were driving down a desert road. My parents came across a truck that had overturned. It was full of Navajo Indians, many of whom were dying at the time. One of the Navajos was dying right next to our car. He looked up at me and I looked up at him. Our eyes met. He passed his soul on to me. So as I stand here before you, I'm blessed with the soul of a Navajo Indian and my own soul. Now, as far as school goes, I started grade school and I acted out a lot. I needed the acceptance of my peers. And I went through high school needing the acceptance of all my peers, but by the end, I just didn't care. I didn't care about society. I didn't want the acceptance anymore. So from high school, I went on to St. Petersburg Junior College, which I hated. I just didn't like Florida, but I thought I'd give it one more chance. So I went on to Florida State University. I hated it again. I decided, man, I need to be out west. LA is where everything's happening. I need to head to California. So I packed up all my stuff and I headed out west. I headed to LA. I started attending UCLA Film School. Now that was a crazy time, I'll tell you what. I had a lot of fun there. But I was the worst student in the whole class. Nobody liked my films. They used to make fun of me. But I still worked, I did it. Put out some terrible films, but oh well. So I graduated in 1965. I had no idea what life was all about. Didn't know what I wanted to be. Didn't know what I wanted to do. So I decided, man, I'm just going to hang out on the beach in Venice. Everybody's weird down there. I can just hang out and have some fun. So one day as I'm sitting on the beach in Venice, a buddy of mine comes up, Ray Manzarek's his name. And I knew him from UCLA Film School, and we got to talking. He said he was just playing music with a local band. I said, man, I'm just writing some poetry, hanging out. He said, well, you want to start a band? I was like, all right. So we started a band right there. And we both kind of wanted to name it The Doors, from a quote by William Blake about the doors of perception. So there we were, The Doors. So in 65, we just started playing for some friends, just started playing private parties, not doing a lot, drinking a bit, smoking some weed, just experimenting, having a good time. It was a lot of fun. 1966, we got our first real break. We were playing at a club called the London Fog. Now, the London Fog was nothing. It was just a hole in the wall on the Sunset Strip. But the cool thing about the London Fog is it was right next to a bar called the Whiskey A Go-Go. Whiskey A Go-Go was the most happening place in all of Southern California. All the cool bands played there. One night while we're playing at the London Fog, the owner of the Whiskey A Go-Go comes in and he says, man, I can really dig your guys' fresh sound. Why don't you guys come over and be the house band at the Whiskey A Go-Go? We were like, sure, it didn't pay much, but to play there was just the break we needed. So we started playing there in 1966. I also met my soulmate. Her name's Pam Nickerson. I love her very much. She's my soulmate. And we happened to make a record that year. We got a one-record deal with Columbia Records and made our first album. And that takes us into 1967. 1967 was kind of a big year for us. We were still playing at the Whiskey A Go-Go. I started to experiment with a little bit with cocaine and heroin. It was no big deal, just experiment, having some fun, partying. The band was doing all right, and we signed an 8-record deal, which was amazing at the time. Nobody ever signed 8-record deals, but we got an 8-record deal. 1968, we started taking a tour. We started touring the whole country. The band came up with some crazy idea that they couldn't trust me anymore. They said my drug problem was getting out of hand. I didn't have a drug problem. I was just having a little fun. They said I was unreliable. Man, you can count on me. I'll go out there and sing, maybe only a song or two, but I'll go out there. So that takes us into 1970, where I met a beautiful woman. She was doing an interview with me while we were on a world tour of Europe. And she was interviewing me for a magazine in London. We fell in love immediately, decided we were going to get married. Mind you, I still have my soulmate at the time. So we got married in a Wicca ceremony where we binded our wrists, cut our wrists, dripped some blood in a bowl, signed our marriage certificate with blood. It was a beautiful ceremony. I wish you were all there. Then we went into 1971 where the band was getting really fed up with me for God knows what reason, but I guess they were sick of me at the time. Still coming up with the same old, you have a drug problem. Come on. So we made our last album in 1971. The lady I got married to with the Wicca ceremony was getting on my case, so I ditched her. I went back to my soulmate Pam, who I love very much. we decided we were going to retreat to Paris. So in 1971, we headed off to Paris. We just hung out in a small hotel. And that's where I've been ever since, in a small hotel in Paris. So in closing today, I want to leave you guys with something that I wrote a long time ago. It still holds very near and dear to my heart. This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end. It hurts to set you free, but you'll never follow me. This is the end of laughter and soft lies. The end of nights we try to die. This is the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim. Now it's your turn to ask questions of our historic characters. Dean, is there a mic in the audience for them? Okay, if you want to please come forward, and you can use this mic if you have questions for any of our historical characters. Any questions? Here comes one.
Ernest, I was curious. Between the time you decided to pull the trigger and you actually did, what did it feel like?
Is it my turn? Yeah. That's a question that I wish I could answer. But there comes a time when you simply can't deal with the reality that reality is brought to you. And it was not the first time that I suffered. And I wouldn't recommend it for necessarily other people, but it is almost a Hemingway family tradition to choose our time of exit. And so I did not feel against it, making that choice for myself.
Other questions for any of our historic people?
Mr. Morrison,
How's it going?
do you feel that people focused too much on you being a star, a big rock star, than your poetry itself?
Yeah, people tended to look at what I did on stage. I was arrested about 3 times for taking my pants off. You know, I was just trying to express myself. And people really didn't get that about me. They just thought that I was some musician up there for shock radio or shock, music. But that wasn't it. I was trying to start my own revolution, my own people. I had beautiful poetry that nobody really listened to much. So yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the head, that people didn't. I should be up here to be a great poet. I should be a great writer. I shouldn't be up here to be a musician. I'm not really a musician. They just put music to my poetry. So thanks for the question, bud.
Other questions for any of our other guests?
This is a question for George. George, I've always been fascinated with the unusual rhythms and syncopation of your music. Can you tell me where that came from?
The only thing I can tell you is that it came from me, and it came from me living in New York City. My keyboard before I started playing the piano was the streets of New York, and the sounds and the noises and the chaos and all the things that were going on there. And I just started playing with fascinating rhythm from almost the moment I started playing. And it just got better and better and better. And I can't claim that I worked hard at night doing this. I just sat down at the piano and it came. And it came. I think of jazz, and of course I'm part of the historic stream of jazz from ragtime and from black and Negro music in the early part of the 19th century. And that's our folk music, and it's full of rhythm. As I said earlier, you've got the folks in the plantations were not able to have banjos and instruments. They were not allowed. So they simply used their hands and their feet to tremendous rhythm, we have tremendous rhythm, and I just picked up on that like I had an antenna.
Miss O'Keefe, did you feel like you were living in and experiencing and painting part of the last frontier when you went south?
No. I felt like I was painting what I saw. And it was new to me. It wasn't the last thing, it was a beginning. And I painted images that they were about the way I saw things.
Ms. O'Keefe, do you have a sense of humor?
It's my own humor.
So it would seem. Are there other questions that anyone in the audience would like to ask of any of our characters? This gentleman. Go ahead and get called out from there.
For Jim Morris, did you moon any famous people?
I don't know if I mooned anybody really famous, but I'll drop my pants here and there, you know, and take my shirt off.
Not here, you won't.
Yeah, I never really mooned too many people. I just mostly took my clothes off to express how beautiful the naked body is. I didn't do it just to spite somebody and to moon them.
Still on the sauce, she says. Other questions, anyone?
This is for George. Did you perform at the Algonquin during the 20s and 30s with Berlin and those folks?
I don't think that there was a hotel or a private party that I missed. And I got invited to a lot of them so I would play, and I wouldn't go unless I could play, at least half the time. Lots of times there were other pianists there, and I would have to. I thought I was very friendly about it, but I really enjoyed it most when I was sitting at the piano. And I do remember one occasion in the late 20s in the Algonquin, but mainly private parties.
Seem to have a group of mostly party animals, with one exception. Good thing she didn't paint people. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Ms. O'Keefe?
I had my parties.
Tell us about parties. Can you tell us about your parties?
I didn't like parties with a lot of people. Small parties, small groups. Alfred was one that liked to talk with a lot of people. I didn't particularly care for that. So I got sick of it. I went off into my room, but I had my own parties. And I went on my own walks in my own time, and those were my parties. Maybe you don't understand that, but that's okay.
Thank you, Ms. O'Keefe.
Is that why your paintings and your art look so sterile?
Well, that's an unfortunate opinion that you have.
Yes.
Miss Carol, I'd like to know why you left Virginia Graham out of your top.
I think you're referring to Sheila Graham.
Sheila, my, yes.
Sheila and I met, in fact, at the film that Ernest was showing in 1937 in LA, and afterwards at a party at Frederick March's house. You must understand that by that time, Zelda had been mostly in institutions for over 7 years, and Sheila was remarkable in that she had a very strong physical resemblance to Zelda. Like me, she was trying to get away from her past. She had grown up a Cockney in the south side of London, but tried to pass herself off as royalty, made her way over to Hollywood, scratched out a living as a Hollywood gossip columnist, and I am eternally in her debt. I don't believe that I was an alcoholic. Sheila did. My agent, Harold Ober, did. Ernest did. Max Perkins did. But Sheila, of all those people, was the one who nursed me and brought in, at one point, 4 medical personnel. I stopped cold turkey. I went through the DTs. I saw animals crawling up my apartment walls. But I understand the implication of your question. Yes, we became lovers, and she was my mistress for the last 3 years. When I suffered the third and final of my heart attacks, I was in her apartment. At that point, with complications of tuberculosis and heart disease and the drinking, I was unable to walk upstairs, and so we moved together into a first-floor apartment. She made The Last Tycoon possible. I was able to work only for 3 or 4 hours at a stretch while lying in bed, and it was really due to her that I minimized my drinking and was able to finish my last novel, The Planet Out, even though it ended in an unfinished state. Sheila was a remarkable woman, and it was not until 1958, Beloved Infidel, that she started to trade on my name and reveal some of the secrets that we had shared. That's the story of Sheila Gray.
Mr. Fitzgerald, can you tell us the rest of Zelda's life? What happened to Zelda?
Zelda, you must understand, from 1930 until her death in 1948, spent almost all her life in asylums. And I want to emphasize that I would not allow her to live in a public institution. Only the best for her. We finally settled on the Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. The place looked like a resort or a golf course. There were times I was able to take her out for vacations. We went to Cuba, to Miami, to New Orleans. For brief periods of time, she was stable enough to live with her family in Alabama, but most of the time she returned to an institution, and she became, as I told many friends, quite frankly, a pathetic figure in her later years with the eczema. She looked much older, a sad woman who read her Bible, and here's the really sad part of the story. She developed an intense fear of fire. 8 years after I died in 1948, she was in the Highland Hospital. She had returned in 46, I'm told. And a pyromaniac, an arsonist, started a fire in the hospital. It quickly consumed the second floor, and the fire escapes went up to the third floor where she was, in a room chained with 6 other women. And the only way they could identify the remains was because of a distinctive shoe that was next to her. She died a horrible death, and at least now we rest together under a common gravestone in Maryland with the last line of Gatsby above us, and our daughter Scotty joined us in 1986. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. That's the rest of Zelda's. Initially, Dr. Farrell at the clinic, the Prangin Clinic in Geneva,